torpedo tubes loaded, target acquired. A vessel moving without escort, without zigzag pattern, without any apparent awareness that it was being watched. Through the periscope of I-58, a Japanese submarine positioned in the Philippine Sea, Hashimoto watched the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis cross his crosshairs like a man walking blindly into traffic. He fired 6 torpedoes at 2-minute intervals. 2 of them found their mark. What happened next, the sinking, the sharks, the 4 days adrift, became one of the most documented tragedies of the entire Pacific War. Nearly 900 men entered the water. 316 came out, but the story you know ends at the rescue. It stops at the horror of the ocean and the failure of the Navy to answer distress signals that were received and ignored. It wraps itself around Captain Charles McVay III, the commanding officer who was court-martialed and made to carry the weight of institutional failure until he put a gun to his head in 1968. That version is incomplete. Because buried beneath the court-martial, beneath the shark attacks, beneath every documentary and Hollywood dramatization, is a question that was never seriously asked in public. How did a ship carrying components of the atomic bomb that would destroy Hiroshima end up sailing alone, unescorted, through waters already known to contain enemy submarines? And why was the pilot who detected and reported the attack scrubbed from every official record as though he had never existed at all? The USS Indianapolis was not a routine vessel. By the summer of 1945, it was one of the most consequential ships in the United States Navy, though almost no one was permitted to know it. In late July, it had completed a classified mission of extraordinary importance, delivering the enriched uranium core and components of Little Boy, the atomic bomb destined for Hiroshima, to the island of Tinian. The Indianapolis had made that delivery on July 26, 1945, faster than anyone expected, a record run from San Francisco in 10 days. Then it sailed south toward Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to rejoin the fleet for further operations. It was sailing into a killing ground. The Philippine Sea in the summer of 1945 was contested in ways the official orders did not fully acknowledge. Japanese submarines still operated in the region. Admiral Suemu Toyoda's naval command, though collapsing under American pressure, had not surrendered its undersea capability. American naval intelligence had intercepted signals suggesting enemy submarine activity along the very route the Indianapolis would travel. Those intercepts were classified, and the routing orders given to Captain McVay did not fully reflect their content. McVay commanded a ship of approximately 1,200 men. He had requested an escort. He was denied one, on grounds that none were available, a claim that became increasingly difficult to sustain once investigators began examining the movement logs of vessels in the region. He was given routing instructions that directed him through the Philippine Sea on a course that made no allowance for the submarine threat his own superiors knew existed. He was also ordered to zigzag at the captain's discretion in conditions of good visibility. On the night of July 29th, visibility was poor. McVay ordered the ship to stop zigzagging. That decision would later be used to destroy him. The Indianapolis was not equipped with sonar. It had no destroyer escort. It was carrying nearly 1,200 men at the end of a war that everyone assumed was nearly finished, and it was moving through water that contained at least one Japanese submarine, Hashimoto's Y-58, that had been hunting in the area for days. There was one more thing. When the Indianapolis arrived at Leyte Gulf, no one was expecting it. The vessel had been removed from a tracking board at Port Director Leyte's office without any corresponding instruction to note its expected arrival. When it failed to appear, no one filed a report, no one raised an alarm, no one sent a search plane. The ship was missing for nearly 4 days before anyone went looking. The men who went into the water on the night of July 29, 1945, did so in stages. The first torpedo struck at approximately 12:14 a.m., hitting the bow. The explosion blew off the entire front section of the ship. The second torpedo hit within seconds, detonating near the fuel tanks. The Indianapolis was equipped with the same basic damage control capabilities as any heavy cruiser, but the impact sequence was devastating. Both explosions happened so quickly in such a forward position that the ship's nose began to sink almost immediately. Captain McVay was in his sea cabin. He was thrown from his bunk. He went to the bridge. What he found there was a vessel in uncontrollable descent. The forward magazine had not exploded, but the flooding was catastrophic. The engines were still running, which meant the ship was still moving through the water, and that motion was driving the ocean into the open wound of its bow. He gave the order to abandon ship somewhere between 12 and 15 minutes after the first torpedo hit. The Indianapolis was already listing at a severe angle. Many men never received the order. Communication was severed. Men were already in the water. Some were burned from fuel fires on the surface. Some were trapped below decks. Some jumped and hit wreckage on the way down. Approximately 900 men made it into the Philippine Sea alive. They had life jackets, most of them. They did not have adequate life rafts. They did not have fresh water. They did not have shark repellent in quantities sufficient for their numbers. And they did not have any expectation, based on anything they had been told, that their absence would trigger an immediate search. The sharks came during daylight. The species that dominated the attacks was the oceanic white-tip, a deep-water shark that does not typically venture into coastal areas and is consequently less studied and less feared in popular imagination than the great white. But in open ocean, in the presence of blood and debris and the low-frequency vibrations of men treading water, the oceanic white-tip is one of the most dangerous animals on the planet. The survivors reported them circling throughout the day, attacking from below, dragging men under without warning. The attacks continued for 4 days. Men who were wounded attracted sharks. Men who were unconscious or too weak to fight attracted sharks. Men who died attracted sharks. The living watched the dead disappear. Some of the living disappeared while still screaming. The salt water, the exposure, the lack of fresh water began to drive men into hallucinations. Some drank seawater and accelerated their own deaths. Some believed they saw land. Some became violent. Small groups of survivors clustered together, trying to stay coherent, trying to stay alive, trying to believe that someone was coming. On August 2nd, 4 days after the sinking, a Navy patrol aircraft spotted the oil slick and the men in the water. The pilot, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn, had been flying a routine anti-submarine patrol. He spotted the slick by accident. His radio operator transmitted the report. A PBY Catalina under Lieutenant Adrian Marks was dispatched to investigate. What Marks found when he arrived exceeded the parameters of his orders. He was not authorized to land in open ocean. The conditions were dangerous, and the procedure was not sanctioned. He landed anyway. He began pulling men out of the water by hand. He taxied his aircraft through the debris field and loaded survivors onto the wings and into every available space until the aircraft was beyond its rated capacity. He kept going. By the time surface vessels arrived, Lieutenant Adrian Marks had already saved a significant number of lives through a decision that violated standing orders. His name does not appear prominently in the official Navy investigation of the Indianapolis disaster. The pilot who first spotted the survivors, Wilbur Gwynn, received credit. The surface vessel commanders received credit. The institutional response was framed around what had failed and who was responsible at the command level. Marks received a letter of commendation. Then he was quietly moved along. The machinery of accountability needed someone to blame, and it did not need a lieutenant from a PBY Catalina complicating the story by demonstrating that individual courage could operate faster than institutional command. The court-martial of Captain Charles McVeigh III began in December 1945. It was, from a legal standpoint, almost without precedent. McVeigh was charged with hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag. To support this charge, the Navy did something that had no parallel in American military jurisprudence. It called Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine officer who had sunk the Indianapolis, as a witness for the prosecution. Hashimoto testified that zigzagging would not have changed the outcome, that he had a clear shot regardless, that the Indianapolis was a target he could not have missed under the conditions that existed. The Navy used his testimony selectively. The court-martial proceeded. McVeigh was found guilty. The officers who had failed to report the Indianapolis as overdue were not charged. The officers who had routed the ship through waters with known submarine activity without providing escort were not charged. The officer who had removed the vessel from the arrival tracking board without providing any alternative oversight mechanism was not charged. McVeigh was convicted and sentenced. The sentence was later remitted. He was allowed to retire with rank, but the conviction stood. He received hate mail for the rest of his life from families of the men who died. Some of it was organized. Some came from people who had seen media coverage that framed the disaster almost entirely as a result of McVeigh's judgment failure. He shot himself in November 1968. He was found on his front lawn, holding a toy sailor in one hand. The institutional record that survived him told a coherent story. A captain had failed his duty. The Navy had investigated and administered justice. The matter was resolved. What that record did not dwell on was the routing decision. Naval routing orders for vessels in the Philippine Sea during the summer of 1945 were the responsibility of officers who had access to submarine intelligence that was not shared with commanding officers like McVeigh. The route given to the Indianapolis was not marked as hazardous in the orders McVeigh received, despite the fact that intelligence reports from the preceding weeks had identified Japanese submarine activity along that corridor. The officer responsible for routing, Commodore Norman Gillette, was acting commander of the Philippine Sea frontier. He was not called to account in the court-martial in any meaningful way. The routing officer under his command, who processed the actual orders, gave testimony that was carefully limited in scope. The failure to report the ship's non-arrival at Leyte was attributed to procedural confusion. 3 separate commands had overlapping responsibility for tracking the Indianapolis's arrival, and each one operated under the assumption that one of the others was handling it. In practice, none of them were. The tracking board removal, the specific administrative action that created a void in accountability, was traced back through testimony that grew increasingly vague as it approached anything resembling individual responsibility. The Naval Court of Inquiry, which preceded the court-martial, reviewed the routing and tracking failures and determined that while errors had been made, they did not rise to the level of courts-martial. The officers involved received administrative letters. Some received nothing at all. The Navy's position, delivered through the court-martial and through the official inquiry reports, was that the central failure had been McVeigh's. Everything else was procedural inadequacy, regrettable, correctable, but not criminal. There was no mention, in any official public document of the period, of a pilot named Wilbur Gwynn's original report being delayed. There was no official accounting of exactly how many hours elapsed between the first distress signals that some survivors claimed to have transmitted and any confirmed acknowledgement by naval authorities. There was no investigation into whether a faster institutional response, triggered by the non-arrival at Leyte, could have saved men who died on the 3rd or 4th day. The timeline was not examined as a prosecutorial matter. It was examined as an administrative matter. The distinction is not semantic. Administrative findings do not produce criminal accountability. Administrative findings produce memos. In 2000, Congress passed a resolution signed by President Clinton that exonerated McVeigh posthumously. The Navy acknowledged that the court-martial had been a miscarriage of justice. The official record was amended to state that McVeigh was exonerated of all wrongdoing related to the loss of the Indianapolis. Hashimoto, who by then had become a Buddhist priest in Kyoto, sent a letter to the U.S. Congress in support of McVeigh's exoneration. He had been sending letters in support of McVeigh for years. The men who had routed the Indianapolis into an unescorted crossing of a submarine patrol zone using intelligence they did not share with the commanding officer were all dead by then. They had lived full lives after the war. Their names appear in military records as men who served honorably. The routing decisions they made appear in those same records without adjudication, without formal censure, without any mechanism that connected their choices to the 576 men who died in the Philippine Sea over 4 days in July and August of 1945. Wilbur Gwynn, the pilot who spotted the survivors by accident on August 2nd while flying a routine patrol, 4 days after the ship went down, died in 1982. His discovery saved the remaining survivors. His name is commemorated at the Indianapolis Memorial in Indianapolis, Indiana. Adrian Marks, the pilot who landed his aircraft in open ocean in violation of standing orders and loaded dying men onto his wings until the plane could barely float, died in 1998. He spent decades after the war speaking quietly at reunions and memorials. He never made claims about what he had done. He answered questions when asked. The Navy never formally revisited whether its failure to deploy search assets sooner, given the known submarine threat in the area, given the known absence of escort, given the known non-arrival, constituted something more serious than procedural error. It framed those questions as historical. It answered them administratively. And then it built a memorial. The memorial stands in Indianapolis. It names the dead. It honors the survivors. It acknowledges the court-martial of McVeigh and notes his exoneration. It does not name the officers who routed the ship. It does not describe what those officers knew and when they knew it. It does not explain why a vessel carrying the components of a weapon that would end the war was sailing without escort through water that the Navy's own intelligence had flagged as dangerous. A ship full of men disappeared into the Pacific. The Navy did not notice for 4 days. When it finally looked at why, it found a captain to convict. The rest of it was filed away, classified, then declassified, then largely unread, sitting in archives that are open to anyone with the patience to look, describing in the flat language of military bureaucracy exactly how the most powerful Navy in the world lost nearly 1,000 men to a single submarine, ignored the silence that followed, and then arranged its verdict so that the silence could continue. History did not bury this story. The people responsible for it did. And they used the court-martial of a decorated officer and the grief of 576 families and the institutional inertia of a Navy that had just won a war to make the burial stick. McVeigh's conviction was overturned 55 years after he died. The routing orders have never been overturned. They remain in the record exactly as written, as operational decisions made in good faith, under pressure, in wartime. Nobody ever had to answer for them. That is not the end of the story. That is the story.